All right, Psalm 79. Let's call this one an obscured narrative in this psalm that begins in verses 1 through 4 as an appeal to God to recall the way in which the nations have come into his inheritance, defiling the temple and destroying Jerusalem, not only doing all that, but taunting in the process, as in verses 5 through 7. It will turn into a direct appeal to help us understand how long you will remain angry with us, understanding that this isn't just a random occurrence, but this has something to do with sins Israel has committed. In verses 8 through 9, it's going to be an appeal to forgive. As verse 10 goes on to ask, why should the nations taunt, understanding that when God disciplines us, even though it is because of our sins, it implicates his name and begins to call into question whether or not we're really his people. Why are we going through it this way? As he will go on to say in the second half of verse 10, for that reason, God avenge against them. The way in which they're not just taunting us, but they're taunting you. And we know you haven't sinned. As he goes on in verse 11 to say, we know, and this is my ad lib, we know you don't have to hear our prayers, but in spite of all the things we've done, I'm appealing to you to listen to us once again. And in verse 12, return the taunts of the enemy upon them. As in verse 13, he's going to say, we will in turn praise you if, once again, you will forgive us. This chapter reminding me of the way in which the barber shop where I used to get my hair cut as a kid had a sign hanging up, prominently posted, saying, never argue with the foolish. It really said never argue with the fool, but I'm trying to tidy it up a little bit. Never argue with the foolish, because people might not be able to tell the difference. And it had two men super angry, arguing with each other, illustrating the fact that you couldn't necessarily tell out of the two of them which one was actually making sense. And so that reminded me of this psalmist who in verse 9 is saying, Lord, for your name's sake. He realized that there was a larger issue, and that was in the way that God had brought them low in order to build them back up again. What was happening in the meantime is they were looking like they were no different, or actually even worse off than the nations who had no God whatsoever. And so what was being obscured was the narrative of what actually does produce success, understanding that while God was disciplining Israel, it created the appearance that there was no more advantage in following God's ways than there would be in following the myths of the people, allowing them to create the narrative that Israel was actually suffering this because they were following God's ways, forgetting that, as the psalmist noted, they weren't actually following God's ways, and that is why they fell into this condition. And so my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that insofar as we have a relationship with God, it's going to attract one of two results. As the writer of Hebrews says in chapter 11, verse 6, passage we quote often, the one who comes to God must remember that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him, as the New King James Version says. That promise holds true. And so insofar as we are diligently seeking God, he is actually going to manifest some things in our lives that set us apart as an example that we are actually doing the things he has called us to do. But insofar as we carry his name but walk in strange ways, we are going to attract the very same judgment that he is bringing on the world, understanding that Revelation 18 is an appeal to his people to come out from them, lest you share in their judgment. And so insofar as we call ourselves Christians, but we walk in the ways that attract judgment, we run the risk, as this psalmist realizes, of obscuring the narrative, creating the appearance that we are suffering the results of the consequences of following God's ways when we're really following our own. And even though we live in a world that almost guarantees that whether atheist, agnostic, or Christian, we're going to suffer, as much as possible as Christians, the things we do should not justify the suffering. So when the word says come out from them, it doesn't so much mean stop living amongst non-believers as much as it means stop adopting the habits that justify correction or even condemnation.